It's a new week, and that means it's a new model. So that person outside definitely saw me doing that. This is Groundeffected, and my name is your dad. And boy, do I have a treat for you. This is Gwen from Peach Figure. And this video was in fact sponsored by Peach Figure. That is a Patreon which I will tell you about a little bit later on in this video. And since my videos have been a little bit long lately, I'm gonna cut time. There's no printing, no prepping, and we're just gonna get straight into painting this model. My first step's going to obviously be to give them a coat of primer. And the primer layer is so that the consecutive layers after that will adhere to the resin. But in my experience, you don't even really need the primer layer with certain resins. I do have to say certain resins because maybe it won't work for you, but in my experience with the sundew resin that I particularly use, it will stick pretty well to the resin without a primer layer. And some purists are gonna have an absolute heart failure at me even mentioning that, and I don't even care. But if you can't afford to buy a primer, don't buy a primer, just paint your models. It doesn't matter, do what makes you feel happy. We've all seen enough middle-aged men using a spray can in their back garden. And this is why instead I will just show you the final result of that middle-aged man is using a spray can in the garden. Also, if you don't hang your models precariously like this, are you even modeling at all? By the way, my studio is not dusty. This is just paint because it's on everything. If you paint in any room in your house, it is going to be on everything. So if you don't want dust to look like this in your studio, don't paint in your studio. But I realize that most of you don't have studios and you're probably doing this in your house, in which case your wife's gonna kick your ass, dude. And this is why I made a studio instead of working at home, so that I don't get my ass kicked. Now, while I wait for the model to dry, it is a good time for me to start thinking about colors, how I'm gonna place them, in what order, and where on the model. A couple things stand out already to me. The boots are super easy, the jacket needs to be painted brown, and of course her skin tones, as well as that really cool umbrella. Those are all things that I've identified that need to be spray painted with my airbrush. And that's going to make the job a whole lot easier and make things look a lot better. But first we must wait for this to dry. And now that the primer is sufficiently dry, it's easy for me to start laying down some base coats. Starting with the boots, I'm going to just give them a slight tint with a little bit of blue. That is because black on its own is just a boring color, but because it's quite a cartoony sculpt, this means I can really push the saturation of colors super bright, because that's what cartoons and comics are like. Basically, the next step is going to be laying down some base coats on a lot of pieces that are easy to get those base coats on. For example, the arms. I'm just going to lay down a base coat over all of that, pretty much flat. Setting up the red that's going to go on the umbrella. Basically, you should never paint black underneath red or yellow or anything of the color like that, because it means that you have to lay down white in order to actually build the color up to the color that you need. But it's okay, because I'm going to use white to do a zenithal and volumetric highlight over all the skin tone areas anyway, so I use that over the umbrella before using a red ink to come back in and get a super saturated red out of that effect. As I said before, it is super important to have a very bright white layer, or at least a lighter tone underneath the red, for it to be saturated enough to stand out. I'm then going to start to work on the underlayers for the skin tones on this model, and that is going to be using a color that I like to call pinkle. This is the color that is between purple and pink, which makes it pinkle. But really, we're after the redness, and to get that red, this time I'm going to use an ink just as an experiment, and I'm going to spray that from the shadows, which is going to create a nice blend between the pinkle and this red. Now, this is not the first time that I've painted a grape and considered it human skin. But an important thing about human skin is that it has a lot of colors in it. One of those main colors being the red that is underneath your skin, and that is what we need to show through underneath as the undercoat before we lay down the skin tones. At least that's in my opinion, and there is many different ways to skin this cat, but this is the way that I choose to skin mine. Does mean, however, that I have a couple of grapes hanging off of my bush while I wait for these undertones to dry. And when my berries are ripe, I mean dry, I then take them to start adding the layers of the skin tones over the top. The secret to doing this though is to thin this paint a lot, like super thin, 50-50 if you have to. If it means you have to lay 50 layers in order to get close to the tone that you want, well, then you're doing something right. This is because you're going to be able to build up those tones as you go, giving you so much more control over the depth on the way through. And once again, we are coming to the orcish flesh part, and orcish dermis, whatever you want to call it. It is a magic color that I still haven't found the replacement for. I will find it. I swear to God, I will do my best to find it. I've just been so busy. Give me some time, and when I do, I will let you know. And now, to get away from the skin tones for a bit while it all dries and I do something wrong, I'm going to move over to the base. And on the base, there is a couple of trees, some buildings, and some pavement of sorts. But to start out with, I'm going to paint those trees a very easy way, just using the airbrush, sporadically painting some light green at first, and using a green contrast paint which is partly translucent to spray over that and darken some of the black areas, as well as tint them so they weren't black and they looked more green. I then used the highlighted green to give it a bit of a high spot in the highlighted areas. For the pavemented areas, I used a very simple technique of dry brushing, whereas when my brush was not as dry as one would think. This is because the crevasses on this base are quite deep, so I don't have to be as careful as making sure that there isn't too much paint on my dry brush. But also, I used greys to do this, and in order to bring some color back into that, I sprayed Drakenhof Nightshade into the shadowed areas so that it's not just completely grey. I also dry brushed the buildings using the same greys, but this is to set them up for later on, because I'm going to come back and I'm going to spray a tint over the top of them. But before I do any of that, I need to paint this weird thing that goes across them. I don't know what it is, but in my mind it's probably a piece of metal of sorts, and so I painted it as such. Now for that tint that I was talking about, I'm just going to use Skeleton Horde and very carefully spray that over the buildings. A little bit of overspray here is not the worst thing in the world. However, if you do feel like you overspray too much, it's easy to just come back and paint that silver back over the top again. An awkward thing about making videos on the internet, or anywhere for that matter, is that you have to try and make things cohesive in some kind of a way, and I'm still figuring that out. But what I do know is that I'm meant to show you what's happening as it's happening, and I'm going to try to do that right now. So as you've already seen, the base is on its way. I need to paint the branches or the trunks of these trees and the base will be done. And speaking of done, those friggin' legs or feet are going to be done as soon as I have painted just the little buckle thing that is on the leg shoe. Now you may notice that sometimes I have a difficulty with words, and this leads me to say things like and this is a thing that I just do. So if you don't like it, there is instructions at the end of the video, but more instructions than that is to check out the sponsor of this video down below, and that is Peach Figure, who make some amazing sculpts every single month. You should check them out. I really like some of their sculpts, and I've made one of them in the past before. In fact, I've printed two and put them together, and they go together really well, which is a good thing when you're trying to put together a model. Now we're at the point where I've left things like the skin tones to dry out so that I don't ruin them by adding the next layers, but it is now obviously time to add the next layers. There was supposed to be some kind of cool transition here, but if you just imagine. At this point, I'm pretty much happy with the color of my skin tone. This means that I'm happy with the main color of the skin. But what I want to do is boost those contrasts a lot more. The way that I like to paint really is to really push the contrast between dark and light a lot. And I also paint from sort of an angular lighting, if that makes any sense. I like to make sure that my models have their light defined by me as the artist. And this is just something that I prefer as an artist. Not everyone's going to like that, but if you like the style of painting that you see it coming out of me, then this is how I produce that particular style. Speaking of getting some lighting, I'm going to need to paint a base coat on this skirt on the lady, because at some point I'm going to need to add some shadows to it, and the realistic way of doing this would be to mask off the legs nicely and then put some spray. I'm not going to do that because I don't have time for masking. Masking takes way too long, so I'm just going to paint a base color on it and lower the pressure on my airbrush and very carefully try not to get any of this blue spray anywhere onto the skin tones. But what I can say is that wasn't the hard part, because it was harder coming back the other way with a lighter purple again. This was because the transition between the two colors isn't as good as I'd like if it's just 2 layers of the colors, and so I like to do at least 3, maybe 3 layers, because that gives a really nice smooth transition with the airbrush. I'm going to do the exact same technique on the top of this lady, and that is again very carefully trying not to get any overspray on the skin, but luckily for us, the fact that it's blue means that any blue overspray on the skin could almost be used as a shadow, and because these colors are quite thin, they won't make such a dark overspray before it starts to cause a problem. After I'd painted the jacket, I had decided to call it the end of my day. So I started today fully thinking that I was going to paint and finish this model today, but I got distracted because I forgot to write in my diary that I had a tattoo, and I ended up having to tattoo, and so now it is late in the afternoon and I need to try and get as much as I can get done before I need to go home. Also, if you can't actually tell, it's sunny in England. I want to go out there, but I have to be in here. I need to do my work. I only had a couple of hours left of the day, and so what I decided to do was just give a little bit of shade to the jacket. And as you notice, I've already glued on the arms and also the bottom part that hangs at the bottom part of the jacket. But also, while I was at it, another quick thing that I could do before I went home was quickly paint the buckles on the shoes. When I got into the studio the next day, I decided to tackle the umbrella, and I'm going to use a brush pen for this. I've found that the ones with the harder nibs tend to dry out a lot faster across the top of this matte acrylic paint that we tend to use, but the ones with the brush type nibs last a lot longer. One trick I can say is be careful not to let your fingers go over any of this wet ink, because it will smudge and it's very difficult to get off. Once I had done the lines on the top of the umbrella, I then used black as well as some dark silver. You could just mix black into a light silver to make this color, and I painted the little friggin' things that hold the umbrella together as well as the spike on top. I also used some Talisar blue and very lightly sprayed the bottoms of the raindrops that I printed in clear resin before I glued them into their places on top of this umbrella. I'm not gonna lie, I'm pretty sure I got 1 or 2 of them wrong. There was some keys, and the keys were confusing a little bit, but it doesn't matter. It's raindrops falling on the top of this thing, and they look super cool. It was also at this point that I realized I hadn't painted the trunks of the trees on the base, and I very quickly gave them a simple coat with Sagor brown. For the hair on this model, I think I'm going to try something a little bit different, and I'm going to start out by just painting it pure yellow at first. And again, this ties into the fact that I'm painting in a comic or cartoony style, but I need to still make that not look so stark, so I'm going to use Skeleton Horde to darken it down and give it a little bit of a grit that the hair needs to have in order to not look like it is candy floss or something weird like that. I painted pink onto her fingernails because in the reference images she has a pink fingernails, and normally I would do a fingernail color, which is fingernail color, and then on the end a little bit of white, because that's the easiest way of painting fingernails. Also, I have no idea what color fingernails are. For the eyebrows, I just used Sagor brown. I think realistically though, her eyebrows probably would be a little bit brown, lighter brown, but having a dark eyebrow, especially on a cartoon style, offsets the face so much and it makes the eyes stand out at the end. I just used a very light Magos purple over the lips because I didn't want to have this heavily makeup look to the model, and I painted black eyelashes, which is just over the top and the rim around the eyelashes. I'm mainly just being careful to keep this directly on that rim around the eye. Once I was happy with that, I then shaped the inside part of that using a little bit of a pink on the bottom portion of the inside of the eye. I then put my 4 eyes on, because now it's time to shape up the inside of the eyes, which I've been told is called the sclera. And once I have shaped them very nicely using deck tan, I will then come back in and make sure that everything is crispy clean and smooth. Placing the pupils of the eye and the rest of the iris and all that stuff is usually quite a difficult thing to do, but I tend to find if you make your model look slightly towards one side, it's more difficult to make them look squint than if you try and make them look forward. Once I had made sure that I was happy with the color of the eye, I then highlighted the center of it a little bit more, and I added the pupil, which is just done pretty much by using a ball of paint on the end of a very sharp and small paintbrush. Again, using the 4 eyes is really helpful for this process. Once I was done with the pupils, I gave them a very gentle highlight, which is a specular highlight. I usually do this one from one side with the bigger one and a tiny little dot on the opposite side of that, and then that's pretty much when I can call this model done. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you didn't enjoy this video, I have instructions for that right at the end of the video. I do realize that this should be given out in the beginning of the video, but never mind, the structure is made and it's too late now. But speaking of now, it's time for me to say a special thank you to my Patreons for help keeping the lights blind in my eyeballs. Also, a huge thank you to the sponsor of the video as well. If you are interested in this model or others like it, you should check them out in the description. There will be a link for them. If you are enjoying your time on the toilet, then don't forget to wipe twice, wash your hands, and if you didn't like anything that you saw in this video, I don't really care. You should probably fuck off.